Another important thing is the state audit. The current administration, my opponent's administration, said that they gave a two-line response to a very important state audit that the citizens paid a lot of money for, and they said we're going to address everything in the next year, in the next 12 months. I'm sorry, that's not enough for me. I want the citizens to know how we're going to address every single one of those things in the state audit.
Thank you all so much for coming. I am Missouri State Auditor Susan Monti. The things that are in the audit report reflect the issues that we came up with based on those concerns that are things that the city needs to address going forward and make changes to. The first issue that we found had to do with bidding. There are problems with the way that the city was doing bidding for services and goods. And as you can see, we have a list of items here that we found the bid process was not followed. Even if the city would say, yes, we did, there was no documentation for that. There was a formal bid policy put in place March of '08. We looked in the 1 year that the policy was in place and found all of these items that did not comply with that. If you have 5, if you have 2, it still means you're not complying with your policy. This is a significant dollar amount. Then we looked in general at disbursements, and we found some problems there. We found problems with payments being made off of summary statements, so there wasn't in individual charge receipts and not sufficient detail on the legal bills to tell whether these were appropriate disbursements. Another problem that we had is the council minutes say that they have a list of bills to be paid, and so the minutes say the council approved those payments, but the list of payments or what the council was approving have not been attached to it, so we can't tell what things actually were or were not approved. The city had hired a full-time mechanic to maintain the service vehicles of the city, but there wasn't a formal cost study done on it. Whether or not it was a good or bad decision could not be determined because there was no cost study done. Then we found issues with transferring between funds. The general fund transferred $205,000 into the road tax fund. Transfers cannot be made without having the council involved. The second area we looked at was written contracts. It's for the protection of the city in dealing with outside vendors. We found a lot of examples of where the city was not using written contracts. A payment plan for a demolition of a building that the city agreed to take things on a payment plan, but none of this was established in writing. When you have agreements like this, we couldn't go back and see whether or not it was proper or not. There's no documentation to tell whether the amount charged was actually the right amount or that the agreement was actually being adhered to. State law requires that when you have these types of contracts, they be in writing. It is for the protection of the taxpayers. We found a lot of problems with the way that the city was conducting their public business. Problems with minutes of meetings in general and the way that some of these things were handled. What we found mostly was that there was a lot of areas where minutes weren't actually being prepared at all. If there were work sessions of the city council or committee meetings, in general they weren't preparing minutes of the meetings and some of the closed meetings. So they weren't meeting the requirements of the open records laws, of the sunshine law. The only way that we can go back and see what kind of business the city was doing is if the minutes are accurate. And in fact, we found that there were significant issues there. The agendas for what was going to be covered at the meetings were not adequate. All of the elected officials have to have their salaries set by ordinance, so they actually have to have a meeting and pass an ordinance to set their salaries, and that wasn't being done. And there were also a number of ordinances that were just incorrect. The only way that you know what types of issues the city is supposed to be dealing with is to look at the ordinances. So they need to be reviewed and updated. General city policies and procedures on page 14. There were a lot of written policies that were not established by the city. The city personnel said that there's no cash advances and you're supposed to have your receipts in order to get reimbursed, but we didn't find that it was working in that way. There wasn't a written investment policy. Anytime there were excess funds, they're just put in CDs. The city should look at what is the best way to get the best return on money and develop a policy for when you hit a certain amount, you would go into a different type of fund. Also, the city didn't have an email or internet policy, so there's no restrictions for personal use of computers. Council approval wasn't being obtained for some real estate transactions. There was a purchase of a site for $260,000 above the appraised value. There was no documented explanation for paying the amount above the appraised value. We had some problems with the water and sewer procedures. The Water and Sewer Operating Fund had a negative cash balance of $272,000, and then of course it got transferred and reclassified into the general fund. There was a net operating loss of $245,000. They also had not prepared the final bills and issued refunds or applied deposits when people moved or stopped their service. We were unable to reconcile the water deposit reports and the general ledger balance, and some of these things had not been processed for an extended amount of time. We also had a problem with reconciling the total gallons of water billed to the gallons of water pumped. But when they actually billed them, the differences were 145 million versus 165 million. So clearly a large disparity, about 20% of the difference, and the city had not done anything to reconcile those numbers as to why the amount that they were pumping in water was so far removed from the amount that they were billing for. We found a few issues with payroll and personnel policies. Our salaried employees are not required to do timesheets, but there needs to be some type of account for time. There are a couple of different employees. The municipal judge and the park board president were being paid without having withholdings. We found issues with the budgets and the financial reports. The city did not have complete and accurate budgets. First off, the budgets didn't have beginning and ending fund balances for any of the funds that were budgeted. So there was no way to use the budget in a way as a tool that it should be used. There were also problems, the same problem with the monthly financial reports. And so the council was unaware and unable to monitor the availability of cash. And remember, I had said that there were negative cash balances in some of the funds. The city was not publishing their reports on a timely basis. When they did publish the reports, they were missing some of the funds. For example, the water and sewer fund was not included. Remember, I said it had a negative cash balance. Citizens could not know whether or not they were operating with negative balances. There aren't adequate fuel logs, and the logs actually that they do have are incomplete. We pulled a transaction in May of 2008 and found 29.8 gallons of fuel pumped that we couldn't find on the log, so we don't know where it went. Also, there wasn't a written policy in place for personal use of vehicles. There were individuals that worked for the city transporting non-city employees, and their vehicles certainly a risk for the city, and so there needs to be a written policy in place. Disposal of city properties, there were also some issues there too. Supervisors would turn in a list and they would bid them out, but there was no written authorization from the mayor or council, and in fact there's no real policy in place there to make sure that we're tracking this properly. You have to have adequate records in place so that you can tell what actually the city owns, and if they own it, where it is, and that is a problem without having a policy in place. The park board president was being paid for maintenance of the swimming pool. And when you have individuals in this capacity, there are strict conflict of interest rules. And in order to have this type of an arrangement, then there must be contracts and competitive bids so that you made sure it is not a conflicted out transaction.
I want to make sure that I'm clear here. I am not saying that these recommendations in here are not significant. Whether or not you're complying with things really have to start at the top where your elected officials are. A lot of the things in here have to do with the fact that there weren't policies in place to even take a look at. And so it's easy to change those because those are done at the level where the city council and mayor are involved. If you put all your policies in place, then you probably won't have any problems in the future. But most of the time, if you elect officials to do certain things and they don't do them, the recourse is to not elect those people again. And we really don't have the authority over that.
I want the citizens to know how we're going to address every single one of those things in the state audit. And it's good for the city. I mean, we've all said it'd be good for the city, and the state audit was worth it. We need to make sure that we make the changes that were proposed in that state audit. Very important.